World of Warfare presents the Battle of Berlin. In the spring of 1945, war-torn Europe faced its last major battle of World War II between the Soviet Union and Adolf Hitler's now crumbling Third Reich. The Battle of Berlin would prove to be one of the most bitterly contested offensives of the war, as Stalin's massive 2.5 million-man Red Army systematically crushed the fanatical remnants of Hitler's most ardent followers. Now drug-addled and isolated in his underground bunker in the heart of Berlin, Hitler still held out hope that the Soviets' Red Army could be defeated at the gates of the capital. At the same time, Soviet leader Josef Stalin pushed his generals relentlessly to capture Berlin before the Western Allies could steal his thunder, thereby placing much of Central and Eastern Europe under communist control. Yet the Nazis' last act of defiance served only to trigger one of the most horrific battles ever fought in a city, taking the lives of hundreds of thousands of Russians and Germans in a standoff rooted in honor and military defiance that would divide the continent of Europe for decades to come. Following Hitler's defeat at the Battle of the Bulge, the Nazis' last offensive of the war, Soviet war planners estimated it would take 45 days to sweep through Germany for the capture of Berlin, the city that Stalin called the lair of the fascist beast. The Soviets' great offensive would close in on the German capital from 9 distinct Soviet fronts, with orders for the 2nd and 3rd Belarusian fronts to capture the eastern Prussian cities of Königsberg and Marienburg to the north, while to the south, the 2nd and 3rd Ukrainian fronts would sweep through Hungary before striking into Austria. In the main thrust, the 1st Belarusian front would drive toward the Polish city of Poznan, while the 1st Ukrainian front would strike simultaneously toward Breslau. Standing in the Russians' way to Berlin, however, was the German Army Groups A and Center, along with fixed defensive lines built by tens of thousands of German civilians, based on 7 layers of defensive zones running 300 miles out from the capital. Even if the Soviets managed to cross the Oder River, Berlin's massive concrete flak towers would offer defenders perfect high ground positions to gun down advancing Red Army soldiers. At the start of 1945, Soviet military strength had reached full capacity, boasting 6 million men in all branches of service, 15,000 combat aircraft, 100,000 artillery pieces, and 12,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, including the dreaded Katyusha or Little Kate rocket launcher, nicknamed Stalin's organ by German troops due to the peculiar sound it made on launching, which fired volleys of 48 132mm rockets armed with 40-pound high-explosive warheads that could travel a distance of 9,250 yards. In contrast, the German army was a mere shell of its former self, now desperately under-equipped due to the Allies' ceaseless bombardment of German industry, severely limiting the number of new tanks, warplanes, and artillery pieces entering into service. To make matters even more dire, Allied bombers had systematically targeted the German oil industry at places like Ploesti, Romania, making fuel shortages a constant preoccupation for German commanders of ground forces and the Luftwaffe. Yet topping the list of Germany's woes was a distinct shortage of fighting-age men, forcing the German High Command to conscript boys as young as 16 and men as old as 60. In support of the German military was the Home Guard, or Volkssturm, which was not controlled by the military, but by the Nazi Party itself. Enlistment in the Volkssturm was compulsory for all males in the previously mentioned age brackets. Poorly trained and equipped, Hitler expected the Volkssturm to fight alongside the regular army. However, as the Battle of Berlin intensified, most detachments of young boys and old men would prove to be little more than a tragic loss of life against the Soviets' massive force of men and machinery, all on a collision course for downtown Berlin. The Soviets' great offensive began on the morning of January 12, 1945, when Field Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front unleashed an intensive bombardment by 500 guns massed along the Vistula River, which shattered German defenders after a nearly 2-hour barrage. To the north, the 2nd and 3rd Belo-Russian fronts attacked the German 3rd Panzer Division, along with elements of the 2nd and 4th Army defending East Prussia on January 13th, slowed by marshy terrain that delayed their push to the Baltic until January 26. Meanwhile, in the center, Field Marshal Georgy Zhukov's 1st Belo-Russian Front smashed through German defenses on January 14th, taking Warsaw in less than 3 days. By January 26th, the fortress city of Poznan was cut off amidst a disintegrating German front, which found both Zhukov and Konev reaching the Oder River, less than 40 miles from Berlin. Bogged down by fierce blizzards across Eastern and Central Europe on January 27th and 28th, when a sudden thaw descended on the 31st, the Luftwaffe flew more than 5,000 sorties against Soviet positions over the next 48 hours. And while the Russians managed to seize several bridgeheads over the Oder, despite intense attacks from the air, Zhukov ordered his forces to rebuild their supply lines for an assault on the German capital on February 15th. Zhukov's hopelessly ambitious plan soon bogged down in systematic chaos among Russian soldiers who chose rape and plunder as a vastly more attractive pursuit than fighting. The collapse of Russian discipline led to probing attacks by the German 3rd Panzer Army into Zhukov's lines, only to lose momentum on February 17th when the Germans' commander, General Walther Wenck, was seriously injured in a road accident. Despite growing numbers of German troops positioned between the Soviets and Berlin, up to more than 1 million German soldiers by April 16th, throughout March and the first 2 weeks of April, the Red Army continued to chip away at German defenses until Zhukov's troops reached the Silo Heights, which was a 200-foot-tall sandy ridge near the Oder Valley that was heavily fortified with German anti-tank guns, machine gun nests, and assault guns above the valley plain below. To overcome the Germans' high ground advantage, on April 16th, Zhukov fired 500,000 shells at the Silo Heights, unleashing the most stupefying concentration of destructive firepower yet recorded in military history, only to face German counterfire that ground the Russians' advance to a halt. Despite withering counterfire, Zhukov's 1st Guards Army overran German trenches at the foot of the Silo Heights. However, the upper line of German defenders proved impossible to storm, leading to a vast traffic jam of more than 1,300 tanks and self-propelled guns under heavy bombardment by German high-ground artillery. It would take 3 days and 30,000 Russian lives before Zhukov could finally take the heights before his frantic dash for Berlin, while Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front bypassed the slowdown to reach the upper stretches of the River Spree that flowed through the heart of the capital. Finding the river fordable, Konev's lead tanks stormed across the river before shattering German defenses. After reporting the news to the Kremlin on April 18th, Stalin gave Konev the order he wanted to hear. He could finally turn his 2 tank armies for the final push for Berlin. That same day, 50 miles to the north of Berlin, Field Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky's 2nd Belo-Russian Front launched an assault on the lower reaches of the River Oder before facing off with more than 30 German counterattacks that delayed his advance by 2 days. From a strategic vantage point, however, Rokossovsky's action kept the German 3rd Panzer Army away from the defense of Berlin. On the morning of April 20th, Hitler's 56th birthday, with Russian forces only 20 miles from Berlin, American bombers launched the final 1,000-plane bomber raid of the war, decimating an already bombed-out capital city in an attack that severed the last of Berlin's water and gas supplies. As Berlin's civilian population reemerged from cellars to desperately scavenge for food and water, the Führer emerged from his bunker 55 feet beneath the Chancellery Garden. celebrating his birthday with a small cadre of Hitler Youth instead of his usual 40,000-man parade. It would be the last time Hitler would be seen in public ever again. After Zhukov's Second Guards Tank Army reached the northeastern suburbs of Berlin on April 21st, Nazi officials began to flee the city in droves, taking with them as many valuables as they could, while some 2 million ordinary citizens were forced to stay behind under penalty of death should they attempt to flee the growing disaster. On April 24th, units of the 1st Belarusian and 1st Ukrainian fronts joined up southwest of Berlin, just as American and Russian troops met on the banks of the River Elbe, effectively cutting Germany in two, while trapping some 300,000 German soldiers and Volkssturm in an ever-tightening pocket. In response, Hitler ordered 12th Army Commander General Walther Wenck to link up with the German 9th Army in defense of the capital, penetrating to within 15 miles of Berlin before stalling due to heavy Soviet resistance on April 26th. 2 German corps would eventually break out of the 9th Army pocket to link up with the 12th, but the rest would perish to a man. With the experience of Stalingrad freshly behind them, Zhukov and Konev regrouped their forward units in Berlin for siege warfare, tightening the noose around the city with anti-tank guns, tanks, assault guns, and a flamethrower platoon, blasting their way from building to building as they cleared structures one room at a time. Without a single pause in the fighting, some 500,000 Soviet troops surrounded Berlin with 12,700 guns, 21,000 rocket launchers, and 1,500 tanks, against a surrounded garrison in possession of precious little combat experience. The Soviets' ceaseless barrage managed to kill thousands of defenders and civilians, at the same time clogging the streets of the central district with rubble and other formidable obstacles. Fanatical SS units, backed by artillery and tanks, contested every strong point, often to the last man, while thousands of Hitler Youth, armed with Panzerfaust, single-shot anti-tank weapons, turned the streets of downtown Berlin into killing fields for Soviet tank crews. As the Red Army bore down on the heart of the city, desperate German defenders created obstacles to slow the Soviets' advance, forcing the Russians to blast their way forward by dynamiting holes in the walls of homes and businesses, or tunneling beneath the city from cellar to cellar, often fighting hand-to-hand as they eliminated bunkers, pillboxes, and strongpoints. Also trapped in the Russian vice were Dutch, Danish, Flemings, Norwegians, and Frenchmen, who would join the SS in their crusade against the Bolsheviks. And while their homelands had now been liberated from Nazi occupation, they were forced to fight and die in the final battle of World War II Europe. By April 27, the Germans had been pressed into a 10-mile-long by 3-mile-wide corridor that witnessed hundreds and possibly thousands of German deaths every passing hour. General Helmuth Weidling, battle commandant of Berlin, reported to Hitler that there was just a 2-day supply of ammunition left, while the wounded were dying in droves for lack of food and medicine. On April 28th, Hitler received a BBC report originating from Reuters, stating that Reichsfuhrer Heinrich Himmler had offered Germany's surrender to the advancing Allied armies, which threw Hitler into an inconsolable rage, prompting the Führer to make the final decisions of his life. Shortly after midnight on April 29th, he married longtime girlfriend Eva Braun in a small civil ceremony in the map room of his bunker. Hitler then hosted a modest wedding breakfast with his new wife before taking Secretary Traudl Junge to another room to dictate his last will and testament. The following day, Hitler appeared in a bunker corridor to offer his final farewell to about 20 assembled people, most of them women, shaking hands with each of them before retiring to his quarter for the final moments of his life. Hitler chose a pistol and poison method, which was suggested by his physician, while Eva Braun chose cyanide alone. Per Hitler's orders, both their bodies were dragged into a garden outside the bunker, doused in gasoline and set on fire. On April 30th, Zhukov's men had fought their way to within sight of the Reichstag, which was defended by several thousand loyal SS men. Before the Great Offensive began, each Soviet division had been given matching red victory flags, along with Stalin's promise that any division who hoisted a flag on the roof of the Reichstag would be made instant heroes back in the Soviet Union. Against fanatical resistance by the SS, the 150th Division stood at the threshold of victory, fighting a 10-hour battle to clear the upper stories of the building. At 2250 hours, men of the Soviet 1st Battalion of the 756th Rifle Regiment raised their red flag on the roof of the Reichstag, announcing their victory over Nazi Germany. Pockets of resistance continued throughout the city until the afternoon of May the 1st, when Russian patience at last ran out. At 1830 hours, every gun, mortar, and rocket launcher in downtown Berlin opened fire on the Chancellery building, ending the last pocket of Nazi resistance. The following morning, General Weidling surrendered to the Russians at 6 a.m. before dictating a message transmitted to all remaining Nazi forces in the city, ordering them to lay down their arms. By 1500 hours on May the 2nd, Soviet guns fell silent for the last time. By the end of the Battle of Berlin, Hitler's refusal to surrender before the fall of Berlin cost the Soviets some 305,000 casualties, the worst losses of any battle during the war. And while the number of German military dead remains unknown, some 125,000 civilians perished in the battle, while tens of thousands more had been wounded, raped, or driven insane by the intensity of the battle. On May the 8th, 1945, Germany formally surrendered to the Allies. Accepting on behalf of the Soviet Union was Field Marshal Zhukov, whose conquest of Berlin delivered Stalin not just a final victory over Nazi aggression, but the keys to the future Soviet Empire in Central and Eastern Europe, planting the seeds of a new Cold War conflict between the Communist East and the capitalist West that would divide Europe and the world for the next 2 generations to come.